October 4th, 1957. The grounds of the Scientific Research Institute number 88, just northeast of Moscow. The air was already turning brittle, the first true chill of the Russian autumn biting through the thin, damp wool of Major Georgy Grechko's service uniform. The sky, a vast, indifferent canvas of gray, seemed to press down on the concrete and brick sprawl of the institute. Georgie, an engineer with a mind as sharp and focused as a freshly ground lens, stood shoulder to shoulder with dozens of his colleagues, the brightest lights in the Soviet rocket program, all craning their necks towards a makeshift loudspeaker mounted on a peeling wooden pole. The loudspeaker crackled, spat static, and then a voice, dry and official, cut through the tension. The successful launch of the first artificial Earth satellite, Sputnik 1, weighed 83.6 kilograms, transmitting signals on 20.005 and 40.002 megahertz. A new era of space exploration has begun. The announcement was met, not with a roar, but with a palpable, stunned exhale. Sputnik was aloft. It was a victory, yet the men there, the very ones who had sweated over the R-7 booster, who had argued physics and materials until dawn, knew the grim truth hidden beneath the headlines. Georgie gripped the cold metal of a railing, his knuckles white. The engineers knew the satellite wasn't a triumph of sleek, forward-thinking design. It was a rushed, basic metal sphere. Its battery life was measured in weeks, its payload crude, its mission purely symbolic. To be first. Look at the Americans now. Their press called it Black Saturday. Here, on the hardscrabble, austere soil of the Soviet Union, we had beaten them. The victory tasted metallic and bittersweet. The Soviet Union, still rebuilding from the scorched earth of the Great Patriotic War, was funding a space program with resources stripped bare from the consumer economy. Georgie, and men like him, lived in communal apartments, shared the occasional luxury of a tired, used Moskvich for O2 car, and ate the standard, repetitive rations. Their laboratories were often ill-equipped, their electronic components frequently salvaged or painstakingly handmade. Their pride was immense, but so was the sacrifice. The success of Sputnik, and soon the immense pressure to follow it up with an even greater feat, a manned flight, meant the noose of austerity would only tighten further. The engineers glanced at each other, their expressions a mix of exhausted elation and grim determination. They had a goal, a glorious, world-changing goal, but their reality was one of endless shortages. They couldn't buy a decent pair of shoes, yet they could build a rocket to orbit the Earth. It was a dichotomy that defined the Soviet system. They were the world's leading edge in rocketry, but their homes lacked basic plumbing luxuries. This initial success, this shockwave across the world, would lead directly to the space race. And in that race, the immense, often ignored disparity between Soviet scarcity and American consumer abundance will become not just a talking point, but a weapon. No one among them could yet fathom that while they were fighting to scrounge up reliable transistors, their adversaries were already developing an apparatus that seemed like pure science fiction to them, color television, a device for simple entertainment, while they were fighting for existence itself. The shadow of Sputnik was long, and under it, the seeds of profound, almost unbelievable cultural and technological gaps were being sown. Their journey had just begun. The Americans' response, when it came, would be a demonstration of wealth and industrial capacity that the cosmonauts and engineers would genuinely struggle to comprehend. The year had turned to 1961. Major Yuri Gagarin had returned from orbit a global legend, a smiling testament to the supremacy of socialist science. Yet, back in Star City, the dedicated training facility hidden deep in the forests outside Moscow, the reality for the subsequent corps of cosmonauts remained starkly the same. Take Pavel Popovich, a seasoned fighter pilot now enduring the centrifuge's relentless spin, or German Titov, Gagarin's immediate backup, who shared a small, unadorned apartment with his young family. Their lives were defined by discipline, secrecy, and profound material scarcity. Their barracks were utilitarian, functional blocks of concrete, indistinguishable from thousands of other housing projects across the Soviet Union. The furniture was basic, sourced from standardized state factories. Meals, while nutritious and carefully balanced for the demanding training, were repetitive and served in large, echoing mess halls. The paradox was crushing. These men held the keys to the future, riding our -7 rockets into the cosmos, yet their personal lives reflected the grinding poverty of the post-war Soviet economy. We flew on rockets, but drove old tractors, one engineer would later quip. This wasn't merely a lack of luxury. It was a systemic problem affecting the very tools of their trade. While developing the Vostok and subsequent Voskhod spacecraft, engineers frequently wrestled with poor component quality. Wires frayed, transistors failed under stress, and the sheer reliability of every valve and sensor was a constant, nerve-wracking gamble. The program's founder, Sergei Korolev, the chief designer, was notorious for his explosive rage directed at failures caused by shoddy manufacturing. A rage born of frustration with an industrial machine focused on quantity and heavy industry, tanks, steel, missiles, rather than precision and consumer quality, reliable electronics. The cosmonauts themselves were acutely aware of the contrast with the propaganda. They were heroes, yes, granted certain privileges, but these privileges meant slightly better access to housing, perhaps an extra ration of imported coffee, or the chance to buy a coveted Zenit camera, not personal wealth or consumer choice. They pored over the scraps of information, often grainy photographs and brief articles, smuggled in by intelligence or found in diplomatic circles, describing the American landscape. They saw images of American astronauts living in spacious, single-family homes, driving Chevrolet Impalas and Ford Thunderbirds, and having access to aisles upon aisles of goods in supermarkets. This wasn't just envy, it was confusion. How could a capitalist nation, supposedly decadent and inefficient, maintain such widespread personal prosperity and dedicate staggering resources to a space program like Project Mercury and the nascent Apollo program? The Soviet ideology had taught them that their centralized system was superior, that the resources saved by eliminating capitalist waste were channeled into grand, collective projects like rocketry. But the evidence suggested the Americans were somehow doing both, funding a space race and simultaneously building a life of unparalleled material ease for their masses. The cosmonauts, focused on the immediate, dangerous, and glorious task ahead, filed this confusing data point away. They were winning the initial phases of the race, but the foundation of the competition, the underlying economic might, felt increasingly unstable beneath their own feet. The psychological wall, separating the Soviet Union from the West, was designed to keep not only people, but also ideas and images out. Yet, in the high-stakes world of the space race, a steady, though filtered, stream of American media and intelligence reports flowed into the inner sanctums of the Soviet space program, the TSKBM Design Bureau, and the command center at Tyuratam. This wasn't merely information. It was a mirror reflecting an utterly alien civilization, one defined by the sheer volume of its consumer goods. For engineers like Boris Chertok, a chief deputy to Korolev, and technicians dedicated to the propulsion systems, the intelligence was often jarringly specific. They were obsessed with the Saturn V rocket, analyzing schematics, thrust ratings, and staging mechanisms. But nestled in the same briefing files were details that seemed wildly peripheral to the struggle for space supremacy, yet profoundly disturbing on a philosophical level. Reports detailed the exploding market for personal automobiles in the United States. Not state-assigned black Chaikas for the Politburo, but millions of brightly colored, mass-produced sedans and station wagons clogging miles of newly built, multi-lane highways. A basic, reliable Volga car was a lifetime achievement for an ordinary Soviet citizen. In America, it was a commonplace necessity, often traded in every few years. Then came the reports of home electronics. The Soviets had black and white television. Sets were scarce, expensive, and often housed in cumbersome wooden cabinets. The idea of color television, a technology that demanded incredibly precise manufacturing, complex phosphors, and high-quality electronics, was conceptually possible but utterly unattainable within their current economic structure. Soviet engineers were spending their intellectual capital designing reliable valves to keep a cosmonaut alive in the vacuum of space, while American companies like RCA and Zenith were selling 23-inch consoles capable of displaying football games in vivid hues. This wasn't a matter of rocket science. It was a matter of economic priority and industrial scale. The cosmonauts, often visiting specialized exhibitions or viewing restricted film reels, were particularly struck. They saw photographs of average American homes, spacious, detached houses with well-kept lawns, filled with appliances that were simply unavailable even to high-ranking Soviet officials. Refrigerators with built-in ice dispensers, automatic washing machines, and multiple telephones. To the Soviet mind, indoctrinated with the notion of collective, striving, and resource management, this level of personal material accumulation felt like decadent waste, yet it was underwritten by an economy capable of funding the most expensive scientific endeavor in human history. This realization created a strange, debilitating cognitive dissonance. The Americans were competing with them in space, dedicating billions of dollars to the Apollo program, which promised a moon landing by the end of the decade. Yet, simultaneously, they could afford to lavish their population with an endless stream of non-essential, technologically advanced toys. It didn't make logical sense within the framework of Soviet Marxist theory, which claimed that capitalism was crumbling under its own excesses. The sheer, effortless abundance was not just a threat to the Soviet consumer economy. It was a silent, insidious threat to the very ideological foundation of the Soviet state. The space race was becoming less a contest of missiles and more a contest of economic systems. While Soviet engineers toiled in relative obscurity, often making do with improvised equipment and facing constant political pressure, the American response to Sputnik had coalesced into an unprecedented undertaking, Project Apollo. The sheer scale of the American effort, as meticulously documented in intelligence reports reaching Moscow, bordered on the unbelievable to the Soviet high command. The Soviet space program was run on a shoestring budget relative to its enormous ambition, heavily reliant on repurposing existing military ICBM technology, the R-7 missile that launched Sputnik and Gagarin. Its funding was opaque, nested secretly within the Ministry of Defense budget, and constantly vying for resources with the Red Army's needs. Apollo, conversely, was an open declaration of economic force. President Kennedy's mandate in 1961 had been clear: land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. This wasn't merely a scientific challenge. It was a national mobilization. By the mid-1960s, the Soviet analysts were poring over declassified or leaked figures showing Apollo's budgetary commitment. The numbers were staggering, billions of dollars allocated year after year, eventually reaching a total expenditure equivalent to roughly 2.5% of the United States' gross national product at the program's peak. To men like Vasily Mishin, who took over as chief designer after Korolev's death, and who had to perpetually beg the Politburo for extra steel or better quality wiring, the American spending represented an almost reckless, boundless economic confidence. The infrastructure alone was mind-boggling. The Soviet program had its Tyuratam Cosmodrome, Baikonur, hidden in the Kazakh steppe. The Americans built the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, a facility visible from space, boasting the immense Vehicle Assembly Building, VB, a structure so large it generated its own weather patterns. They developed the Saturn V rocket, a three-stage behemoth that dwarfed the Soviet N-1 in sheer power and complexity. The Soviet engineers could analyze the physics, but they struggled to grasp the industrial capacity required to produce such a machine reliably, multiple times, while simultaneously keeping America's consumer engine humming. Crucially, the Apollo program involved not just government agencies, but hundreds of private contractors: Boeing, North American Aviation, Grumman, and thousands of smaller, specialized firms. This integration of the private sector, often competing fiercely for subcontracts, provided the necessary redundancy, precision, and speed that the centralized, often sluggish Soviet state industry simply could not match. The American system could pivot and adapt with a swiftness that was alien to the Soviet planned economy. The most potent element of this hubris, in the Soviet view, was the confidence not just in the technology, but in the economy that supported it. It signaled that the United States could afford this extravagant space race without sacrificing the comforts and technological advancements enjoyed by the average American citizen, a luxury the Soviet state could not afford. Every successful test flight of the Saturn I, every new Apollo capsule unveiling, confirmed to the Soviet hierarchy that they were not just fighting a scientific opponent, but an economic leviathan that seemed to possess infinite resources. The race wasn't about who had better theoretical physics. It was about who could afford the reliable electronics, the mass production, and the sheer volume of high-quality material required to sustain such an insane pursuit. Deep inside the highly restricted bunkers of the N-1 rocket program near Tyuratam in the mid-1960s, the struggle was brutally tangible. Lead engineers like Boris Dorofeev were engaged in a desperate, hand-to-mouth fight for component reliability. The primary challenge wasn't inventing new physics, but ensuring that the thousands of valves, gyroscopes, and guidance circuits sourced from decentralized, poorly supervised state factories would function flawlessly under the extreme stresses of launch. A faulty soldering joint, a weak vacuum tube, a transistor that drifted out of tolerance. Any of these small defects, endemic to a system prioritizing steel tonnage over micro-precision, could doom the massive N-1 moon rocket. It was into this atmosphere of engineering desperation and material strain that the intelligence reports about the American color television market began to circulate. These reports, often dismissed initially as gross exaggerations or capitalist propaganda, detailed the relentless push by companies like RCA to make color sets commonplace. The Soviets had a state television standard, but it was predominantly black and white, and sets were still relatively scarce. The technology of color transmission, the complexity of the NTSC standard, the necessity of high-precision cathode ray tubes, CRTs, and the sophisticated electronics required for decoding the signals, represented a technological refinement that was breathtaking to the Soviet mind. Colonel Vladimir Komarov, later slated for the ill-fated Soyuz 1 mission, once remarked to a colleague, holding a thin technical briefing sheet on American consumer electronics, "They are devoting industrial plants, factories of men and metal, to painting a dancing girl red and blue, while we worry if the wire connecting the guidance system can survive 2Gs. The sheer concept of diverting intellectual capital, top chemists, physicists, and manufacturing experts, to such a non-essential luxury was a philosophical offense to the Soviet ethos of utility and collective purpose. But the offense quickly turned to a grim realization of America's industrial depth. Developing and mass-producing reliable color televisions required an industrial base capable of maintaining intense quality control and micro-level precision, the very attributes the Soviet aerospace sector desperately lacked. If American industry could produce millions of precise, complex components for home entertainment systems, what level of precision and redundancy were they building into their Apollo guidance computer and their Saturn V's flight control systems? The color TV was not just a toy. It was a devastating proof of concept. It proved that American manufacturing, fueled by consumer demand and private competition, could achieve a level of technological sophistication and reliable mass production that eclipsed the Soviet Union's state-controlled system, even in its most prioritized military and space sectors. It was a clear, vivid signal that the economic gap was not a minor inconvenience, but a structural chasm separating the two superpowers. This luxurious excess, this gilded cage of capitalism, was simultaneously funding the very tools that might win the space race. The massive, looming presence of the N-1 moon rocket dominated the secret assembly facility at Tyuratam, but beneath its towering metal skin, the program was plagued by systemic weakness, a direct consequence of the austerity that was simultaneously funding the American consumer boom. Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, the legendary chief designer, was the beating heart of the Soviet effort. His brilliance in rocketry was unmatched, yet his final years were spent less on physics and more on a constant, grinding battle against ministerial apathy and resource starvation. Korolev had faced political opposition from Marshal Mitre van Netelen, who insisted on developing the smaller, military-derived R-7 rocket instead of the massive, pure space exploration vehicle Korolev championed. When the American commitment to Apollo became clear, Korolev finally received the mandate for the N-1, but the decision came too late, and the funding was always piecemeal and conditional. His request for a dedicated, single-site, modern industrial complex for the rocket's production, similar to the American facilities, was denied. Instead, the N-1's components had to be manufactured in separate factories across the country, Perm, Kuibyshev, Leningrad, and then shipped, often by train and barge, to the remote launch site for final, difficult assembly. This decentralized production chain introduced massive quality control issues. The most critical example was the NK-33 engine, a powerful but complex liquid fuel engine. To achieve the necessary liftoff thrust comparable to the Saturn V's single massive F-1 engine, Korolev was forced to cluster 30 smaller NK-33 engines on the N-1's first stage. This multiplicity was a calculated risk, but it exponentially increased the points of failure. Every engine, every pipe, every sensor had to function perfectly in concert. When intelligence reports detailed the immense power and reliability of the American Rocketdyne F-1 engine, a single 5-unit cluster of which powered the Saturn V, the contrast was stark. The F-1 was a marvel of high-pressure turbopumps and advanced materials, developed with massive investment and rigorous, dedicated testing. The Soviets, lacking the budget and manufacturing precision for a comparable single, high-thrust engine, were forced into an engineering solution that was inherently more fragile. Georgy Babakin, an engineer working on the guidance systems, lamented in his notes that the American economy allowed for brute force perfection, while the Soviet system demanded elegant, perilous compromise. Korolev's death in January 1966 was a catastrophic blow, leaving the N-1 program in the hands of Vasily Mishin, who inherited a flawed design, a stressed timeline, and a permanently under-resourced operation. While NASA was performing integrated tests of the Saturn V and its Apollo module with seemingly infinite redundancy, the Soviet moonshot was perpetually behind schedule, plagued by budget cuts, and fundamentally limited by an economy that, unlike the one-building color televisions, could not afford the necessary industrial precision to match its own cosmic ambition. The N-1 became the physical manifestation of the Soviet system's crippling choice: guns over butter, and in this case, too little of either to win the final prize. The dispatches filtering back to Moscow were not limited to the grand engineering feats of NASA. Often more potent, more insidious in their ideological corrosion, were the routine observations about American daily life. For the Soviet military and space establishment, which operated under a strict hierarchy of state-provided necessities, the visibility of the American concept of the private life was a profound shock. One persistent theme in the intelligence reports and in the rare, restricted-view American magazines that made their way to Star City's reading rooms was the ubiquity of the personal car. To a Soviet cosmonaut, even an elite one like Alexei Leonov, the acquisition of a Ziguli, Lada, or a somewhat better Volga was a sign of significant state favor and often required years on a waiting list. These cars were functional, basic, and often poorly manufactured. They were a tool of mobility, not a statement of individuality or a source of continuous, market-driven innovation. The Americans, however, possessed a rolling spectacle of automotive excess. Briefings showed high-resolution images of vast, multi-level parking lots filled with hundreds of unique, chrome-laden vehicles, the Cadillacs, Mustangs, and Galaxies of the mid-1960s. The sheer number was staggering, but so was the quality and the speed of their design evolution. The cars were powerful, comfortable, and replaced almost whimsically every few years. This constant, Engineered obsolescence represented a drain on resources that the Soviet system deemed unacceptable, yet clearly signaled an underlying economy of terrifying depth. For the Soviet engineers, who often relied on packed public transportation or state-assigned vehicles, the car symbolized freedom and personal autonomy. The American reality, that nearly every family could afford one, often two, of these elaborate machines, implied a level of material wealth that shattered the official narrative of capitalist decay. It wasn't just the cars themselves, it was the supporting infrastructure. The vast network of paved, free highways, the service stations on every corner, the ease of obtaining fuel. This contrast extended into the homes. Intelligence reports detailing the living conditions of American astronauts were scrutinized intensely. The Soviets lived in relatively cramped, state-assigned apartments, often multi-family units, reflecting the nation's housing shortages. The Americans lived in single-family homes, often with 2 stories, multiple bathrooms, and sprawling lawns. They had private refrigerators filled with diverse food options, automatic garage doors, and air conditioning, luxuries that were essentially unknown to all but the highest ranks of the Soviet elite. The cumulative effect of these small details was psychologically significant. It led to a subtle but undeniable conclusion among the technical intelligentsia. The American system, despite its alleged ideological flaws, was demonstrably better at providing for its people while also funding the race to the moon. The Soviet effort demanded personal sacrifice and material deprivation. The American effort was built on a foundation of seemingly endless, thriving consumerism. The Apollo program was proof of American technical might. The endless stream of shiny cars and spacious homes was proof of American economic invincibility. Within the secure, windowless conference rooms of the Chief Designer's Bureau, often late at night after long shifts battling the N1's endemic flaws, select Soviet engineers and senior cosmonauts received what the KGB and GRU had managed to glean about the American way of life. These were not public pronouncements. They were restricted intelligence briefings intended to inform strategic planning, but they often served only to deepen the existing cultural confusion. Colonel Georgy Shonin, a veteran cosmonaut, sat through one such presentation in 1967. The lights were dimmed, and slides, rare high-quality photographs taken by deep-cover agents or diplomatic spies, flashed onto the screen. One slide showed an ordinary American supermarket aisle, an impossibly long canyon of packaged goods, cereals, snacks, and toiletries, each item wrapped in brightly colored, elaborate packaging. The sheer choice and variety was overwhelming to men accustomed to state-run gastronomes offering perhaps 3 or 4 basic types of bread and a handful of canned goods. The intelligence officer narrating the presentation, a man whose voice was perpetually flat and devoid of emotion, attempted to apply the standard ideological lens. "Comrades," he would drone, pointing to the image of mass-produced plastic toys, "this is the wasteful decadence of the capitalist system. Resources are diverted to cheap, transient goods designed to hook the population on consumption, creating a society of ideological weakness." He emphasized the debt, the income inequality, and the inherent instability of the American financial system. But for the scientists and the men who faced death every time they climbed into a rocket, the words rang hollow against the visual evidence. They saw not decay, but efficiency. They saw a society with enough surplus capital and industrial output to waste vast quantities on trivialities while simultaneously constructing the most complex and expensive spacecraft in history. How could a system that was theoretically rotting from within build a rocket that worked every time? The most unbelievable detail, often whispered about in the corridors afterward, related back to the color television. One briefing included technical schematics of the RCA-CTC-15 chassis, detailing the complexity of the Trinitron tube technology. An engineer, Valery Kudinov, who specialized in vacuum tube reliability, quietly calculated the number of man-hours and the material quality required to produce those millions of precisely masked color tubes. He contrasted that with the constant failures of their own simple black and white Rubens sets, and more critically, the substandard quality of the components being delivered for the N1's critical guidance electronics. The abundance presented a painful philosophical riddle. If the U.S. economy was so structurally flawed, why did it generate such widespread prosperity, reaching even down to the quality of its leisure goods? And if the Soviet centralized model was superior, why was the elite space program constantly handicapped by shortages of basic, high-quality parts? This cognitive dissonance led to a secret, internal respect for the enemy's system. Not their ideology, but their industrial apparatus. The American moon mission was being built on a bedrock of economic plenty, while the Soviet one was being built on sheer, heroic engineering willpower, constantly fighting against the grain of its own deprived economy. They understood, with a chilling certainty, that in the long run, will alone could not defeat an industrial machine that could afford to produce both lunar landers and millions of color screens. The calendar flipped to December 1968. The Soviet mood in the corridors of power and the dusty halls of the TSKBM Design Bureau was one of deepening dread. The Soviet manned lunar program, which had aimed to launch men around the moon years earlier, was stalled. The Soyuz program was reeling from the catastrophic failure that killed Komarov, and the massive N-1 rocket had not yet even been rolled out for its first crucial test flight. The Americans were publicly lagging, but their progress was steady, monolithic, and brutally transparent. A transparency that was an implicit challenge. Then came the news, filtering in through frantic late-night intercepts and secure teletype messages. Apollo 8 was going to the moon. Not just a test flight in Earth orbit, as initially predicted by Soviet analysts, but a direct, audacious jump to lunar orbit. The crew, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, were not just flying. They were being broadcast to the world. Cosmonaut Vitaly Sevastyanov was among the first to receive confirmation in Star City. The initial reaction was one of stunned denial, then a wave of cold professional respect mixed with utter despair. The Soviet system could never risk such an ambitious leap. Their protocol demanded incremental steps, ensuring political prestige was never risked by public failure. The Americans, confident in their engineering redundancies and a limitless budget supporting their quality control, had just jumped 3 steps ahead. The difference was immediately clear. The Soviet Zond circumlunar missions, using unmanned Soyuz capsules, were launched in total secrecy. If they failed, and several did, the Politburo simply denied they had happened. The Apollo 8 mission was a global spectacle. On Christmas Eve, 1968, while orbiting the moon, the crew read from the book of Genesis, broadcasting their words, and later, the iconic Earthrise photograph, back to an estimated 1 billion people. For the Soviet engineers watching this unfold through restricted feeds, the broadcast was devastating. It wasn't the Bible reading, nor the stunning photograph that cut deepest. It was the unflappable reliability of the American technology. To broadcast live, high-quality audio and video, even if their broadcasts were in black and white, across hundreds of thousands of miles, while navigating the most demanding deep space mission ever attempted. This spoke volumes about the quality of the electronics, the power of the communications array, and the absolute trust NASA had in its industrial partners. This was the dividend of the color television economy, an industry so advanced it could produce perfect, reliable components on demand for the most demanding application imaginable. The Soviet reality was a stark contrast. In the same month, the N-1 program was struggling to finalize the assembly of the massive booster stages, wrestling with leaky pipes and temperamental guidance sensors. The Soviet moonshot was a cloaked secret, fraught with failure and anxiety, fighting for every ruble. The American moonshot was a public celebration of competence, funded by an economic system so vast it could afford both lunar voyages and the leisure appliances that allowed the world to watch them live. The successful flight of Apollo 8, taking place a world away from the deprivation of the Soviet program, made the underlying economic disparity not just a talking point, but an immediate, terrifying reality of strategic defeat. The Soviet Union's decision to pursue the moon, though fueled by patriotic fervor and ideological competition, was always a secondary consideration to the core mandate of the state: military supremacy. While the Americans could fund Apollo by tapping into a vast, diversified economy and private enterprise, the Soviet space program was merely one highly visible branch of the massive military-industrial complex, and its resources were perpetually subject to the needs of the strategic rocket forces. For chief designer Vasily Mishin, the successor to Korolev, the practical implications of this imbalance were felt in every daily decision. He constantly faced resource allocation battles with the powerful ministries of defense and heavy machine building. The finest steel alloys, the most precise gyroscopes, the most reliable solid-state electronics, the materials and components that were crucial for the N-1 survival, were routinely prioritized for the development of new intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and nuclear submarines. The Soviet leadership, primarily focused on maintaining nuclear parity, viewed the moon race as a political competition, not an existential necessity. They were content to accept a marginal technical gap in space exploration if it meant ensuring the Tu-95 bomber fleet and the R-36 ICBMs were fully funded and operational. This political calculus meant that the very technologies that flowed freely into the Apollo program, advanced miniaturization, high-reliability computers, and sophisticated telemetry, were choked off or severely rationed when they reached the Soviet space sector. Consider the guidance computer. The American Apollo Guidance Computer, AGC, built by MIT, was a compact, cutting-edge machine utilizing integrated circuits, the height of miniaturized electronics. The mass production of these integrated circuits, or chips, was supported by the booming commercial market for calculators and early desktop electronics, leveraging the same industrial base that produced color televisions. The Soviet equivalent for the N-1, the L-3 guidance system, was bulky, slower, and relied on older transistor technology or even vacuum tubes in some earlier versions. Soviet industry simply lacked the capacity to produce reliable integrated circuits in the necessary quantities for both military and space applications. What little capacity existed was reserved strictly for the newest strategic weapons. The cosmonauts understood this sacrifice intimately. They were the visible heroes, but their missions were built upon a foundation of engineering compromise enforced by scarcity. They saw the cost of guns over butter, not in ideological terms, but in the terrifying fragility of their equipment. The reliability rate of components was lower, the testing less rigorous, and the redundancy built into the systems was minimal compared to the American approach. The color TV was an amusing oddity. The ICBM was the reason the N-1 failed. The very system designed to compete with the West was economically structured to hamstring its own most glorious endeavor by prioritizing the instruments of conflict over the instruments of glory. By the spring of 1969, the space race had escalated into a desperate, zero-sum sprint. The success of Apollo 8 had put the Americans irrevocably on track for a lunar landing, and the Soviet leadership, politically mortified, issued a ruthless, implicit order to the TSKBM: launch the N-1 now. The engineering schedule was compressed, vital component testing was skipped, and the inherent flaws built into the under-resourced program were about to manifest with catastrophic violence. On February 21, 1969, the first N-1 rocket, designated 3L, finally lifted from its pad at Tyuratam. Watching from the remote bunker, Chief Designer Mishin and his engineers held their breath. They knew the risks. The clustered 30 and K-33 engines on the first stage, each a potential point of failure. Just 68 seconds after ignition, at an altitude of approximately 12 miles, the impossible happened. A pressure sensor malfunctioned, followed immediately by a fire that erupted in the engine bay. The KWRD engine control system, overreacting to the multiple failures, issued a universal shutdown command. The massive rocket, carrying a dummy lunar module, plunged back to the Kazakh steppe, erupting in a destructive crash hundreds of miles away. The failure was not due to some new, unknown physical law. It was a failure of industrial reliability, a direct consequence of the austerity that plagued the entire program. The component that initiated the sequence was a simple sensor, likely sourced from a civilian factory operating under lax state standards. The engine cluster, a necessity born of budget limitations, turned a minor flaw into a mission-killing disaster. The engineers knew the Americans had the budget for thousands of hours of hot fire testing for every single Saturn V component. The Soviets could only afford limited, sequential testing. The Americans, meanwhile, were executing flawless, complex missions. In March 1969, Apollo 9 test flew the lunar module, Spider, in Earth orbit, perfecting the complex docking and crew transfer procedures. In May, Apollo 10 performed the full rehearsal, descending to just 9 miles above the moon's surface. Every American mission was televised, providing the world with an open demonstration of their system's incredible reliability and redundancy. They were spending freely, and the quality was showing. The Soviet response was a secretive scramble. Miss Hin ordered the second Nin, 5L, to be prepared immediately. The modifications were rushed, the pressure immense. When 5L launched on July 3, 1969, just 2 weeks before Apollo 11 was scheduled to launch, the results were even more spectacular and tragic. A loose foreign object, perhaps a piece of metal debris, entered an oxygen pump on engine number 8 seconds before liftoff. The engine exploded. The ensuing chain reaction ripped through the delicate cluster, and the entire 344-foot rocket fell back onto the launch complex, obliterating the pad in the largest non-nuclear explosion in rocket history. This catastrophic failure, concealed from the world, was the death knell of the Soviet moon race. It was a brutal, visible demonstration to the cosmonauts and engineers that their dedication and bravery were not enough to overcome the fundamental, crippling economic disparity. The American system could afford the meticulous precision required for a moon landing. The Soviet system could not. The race to the lunar surface was lost not in space, but in the factories that produced the sensors and the engine pumps, the same factories struggling to meet quotas for basic black and white television sets, let alone the color ones now flooding American markets. The date was July 20th, 1969. The air across the Soviet Union felt thick with an unprecedented combination of national pride and gnawing humiliation. Officially, the state media, Pravda, and the central television channels downplayed the American achievement, referring to it with guarded, minimal coverage, focusing instead on the latest collective farm output figures or new military exercises. Unofficially, however, the entire elite strata of the Soviet space and military establishment were glued to private, restricted access communication lines, monitoring the unfolding events of Apollo 11. In the secure communications centers near Star City and in Miss Hin's grim offices, technical teams were intercepting the highly encrypted NASA voice and telemetry feeds. They listened as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin performed the final, nail-biting descent of the Eagle lunar module. They heard the telemetry chatter, the altitude calls, and the final, historic confirmation. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. For the Soviet cosmonauts, the immediate, visceral feeling was one of profound, conflicted professional admiration. They recognized the sheer, almost impossible technical mastery required for a successful soft landing. The Apollo Guidance Computer, AGC, had navigated the descent with perfect precision, handling last-second manual inputs from Armstrong over a treacherous boulder field. This was the moment where the industrial superiority of the American system became undeniably, globally visible. The complex, highly reliable computer systems, the perfect integration of the radar and propulsion, the flawlessly maintained life support. These were the fruits of an economy that could afford to produce thousands of high-precision microcomponents for every subsystem. Cosmonaut Georgy Grechko, who had been there for the Sputnik triumph, sat and watched the grainy, delayed images of Armstrong stepping onto the lunar surface. The image was broadcast globally, including a heavily censored, delayed, and technically poor feed on Soviet state television. The visual was not lost on the men of the Soviet program. The Americans had not only achieved the landing, but they had paid for the communications network powerful enough to broadcast the live, high-quality images across the cosmos for a global audience. They could afford a giant television camera on the moon. The color TV was no longer a symbol of mere luxury. It had become the metaphor for the economic and technical divergence that had cost them the race. The same industrial ecosystem that created millions of perfect CRTs and complex electronic components for home use was the one that provided NASA with the perfect, reliable microchips, sensors, and telemetry systems required for a lunar landing. The Soviet engineers realized, with a deep sense of defeat, that their heroic efforts and brilliant theoretical physics had ultimately been rendered insufficient by the inability of their command economy to produce consistent, high-quality mass electronics. The Americans had brought their consumer wealth to the moon, and with it, the victory. The quiet days following the Apollo 11 mission were marked by a grim, internal reckoning within the Soviet space program. The mandatory official congratulatory telegrams to NASA, framed in cautious diplomatic language, masked a bitter, professional inquest led by figures within the Central Committee and the heads of the military-industrial complex. The question was no longer if they had lost, but why, and the answers pointed directly back to the economic system itself. Vasily Mishin, though officially maintaining the N-1 program under the pretense of a backup mission, knew the lunar race was over. He had to face his engineers, men who had dedicated a decade of their lives to this single, glorious objective, and explain the unexplainable failure. It wasn't a flaw in the theoretical rocket equation. It was a flaw in the supply chain. The starkest realization centered on mass production and quality control. American capitalism, driven by fierce competition for the consumer dollar, was compelled to mass-produce complex items, like color television sets and sophisticated hi-fi equipment, with high reliability to avoid devastating warranty costs and maintain market share. This demand for quality flowed upstream, benefiting the aerospace sector. Companies like Texas Instruments, Fairchild, and Motorola, producing millions of cheap, reliable integrated circuits for calculators, had already perfected the necessary materials, science, and manufacturing processes for the Apollo guidance computer's military-grade components. The massive scale reduced costs and perfected the technology. The Soviet command economy, conversely, had no internal consumer pressure for quality. State-run factories were rewarded for hitting output quotas, tonnage of steel, number of units, rather than reliability or efficiency. A faulty sensor in a Rubin television set was an inconvenience for a citizen who might wait years for a replacement. A faulty sensor in the N1's KORD system resulted in a 15-story explosion. The difference between consumer quality and aerospace quality in the U.S. was minimal. In the USSR, it was vast and deadly. Cosmonaut Pavel Popovich later recounted the feeling of profound ideological defeat. We were told the Americans' excessive consumerism was their weakness, but it turned out to be their strength. Their ability to waste so much on entertainment meant they had a foundation of industry so strong, so broad, that our highly focused efforts could not compete. The American economy proved it could generate the dual output, military strength and consumer wealth. The Soviet economy could only truly support the former, and even then, often with compromised component quality. The legacy of the lost race was the painful lesson that material abundance was not a distraction from technical ambition, but its prerequisite. The color television was the proof, a frivolous luxury that quietly testified to the industrial infrastructure capable of putting men on the moon. The American flag planted on the moon in July 1969 marked a definitive end to the space race as the Soviet scientists had known it. For a time, the N-1 program limped on, fueled by political denial. Two final, equally spectacular launch failures in 1971 and 1972, caused by the same intractable problems of engine reliability and component quality, finally forced the leadership's hand. In May 1974, the N-1 program was officially and secretly canceled by decree, marking the final physical surrender of the Soviet lunar ambition. The massive components and tooling were ordered destroyed, preventing any photographic evidence of the Soviet near success. The legacy of the race, however, was not the moon, but the realignment of Soviet priorities. The painful public demonstration of Western economic superiority forced a subtle but significant shift in Moscow. The leadership recognized that while their military technology could compete, their ability to provide for their people and sustain an economy capable of mass-producing advanced, reliable electronics was dangerously lagging. This realization sparked a belated, hesitant effort toward improving the consumer sector and civilian technology in the 1970s, though the entrenched inefficiencies of the command economy proved nearly impossible to overcome. The cosmonauts and engineers, disillusioned but still dedicated, pivoted. The Soviet program focused its unparalleled experience on Earth orbit, leading to the hugely successful Salyut and later Mir space stations. These were longer-term projects that suited the methodical, if slow, nature of the Soviet industrial base. They excelled at endurance, orbital mechanics, and closed-loop life support, areas where mass-produced high-tech electronics were less critical than sheer engineering tenacity and biological understanding. Yet, the image of American economic power persisted. The color television, initially an object of disbelief, slowly began to enter the Soviet Union, first as smuggled goods, then as expensive, state-sanctioned imports, and finally through domestic production attempts that still often paled in quality compared to the Western models. It remained a constant, silent reminder of the industrial gap that had existed between the two systems. The men who built the Soviet space program, men like Georgy Grechko and Alexei Leonov, went on to achieve immense feats in Earth orbit, culminating in the symbolic, yet brief, joint Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975, a handshake in space that acknowledged a truce. But the underlying truth remained. The Americans had won the ultimate prize not simply with better rockets, but with a more powerful economic engine that could afford both the luxuries of consumer society and the necessary precision of lunar travel. The shock of the color TV had been a precursor to the systemic shock of defeat, and the lesson learned by the Soviet technical elite would ultimately contribute to the growing, inescapable awareness of the Soviet system's terminal economic sickness, a realization that would slowly, inexorably, lead toward the collapse of the empire 20 years later. The victory for the West was not just scientific. It was a profound, televised declaration of economic dominance.